In the heart of the Whitefall Mountains, where winter reigned for 8 months of the year, and silence stretched between snowflakes like held breath, Erwin had learned that loneliness was a small price to pay for peace. Her cabin stood at the forest's edge like a single candle flame against the darkness, small, warm, and utterly alone. For 3 years, she had carved out an existence measured in careful preparations and quiet routines, her days shaped by the rhythm of survival that asked nothing of others and expected nothing in return. The world had taught her early that omegas who demanded too little were overlooked, while those who asked for protection often found themselves trapped by the very bonds meant to shelter them. So Erwin chose the cold honesty of solitude over the warm deceptions of belonging. She knew the forest's moods like a mother knows her child's breathing, when the wind carried warnings of storms, when the trees bent low with the weight of approaching snow, when even the mountain itself seemed to huddle deeper into its stone shoulders against the coming fury. Tonight, the air itself felt sharp as broken glass, and the silence between the pine boughs held the terrible expectancy that preceded the worst blizzards. But Erwin had weathered such storms before. Her pantry held enough provisions to last until spring, her firewood was stacked to the ceiling, and her small sanctuary was fortified against whatever winter might unleash. She had become expert at surviving alone, at finding warmth in solitude, at building walls strong enough to keep out both cold and the ache of wanting more than safety. What she had not prepared for was the sound that would come with the storm. 3 desperate scratches against her door, soft enough to be mistaken for wind, insistent enough to break her heart. What she could not have anticipated was the choice that would shatter every careful boundary she had built, challenging everything she believed about strength, survival, and the terrible courage required to let strangers inside when you have spent years learning to live without anyone at all. Tonight, the blizzard would bring more than snow and wind to her doorstep. Tonight, it would bring the family she never knew she was waiting for. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The storm announced itself with a sound like the world tearing apart at its seams. Erwin woke to windows rattling in their frames and wind that howled through the forest with a voice like wounded animals crying for mercy. She had gone to sleep expecting heavy snow, but what raged beyond her cabin walls was something far more violent. A blizzard that seemed intent on erasing the very concept of shelter from the mountainside. She slipped from beneath her thick quilts and padded barefoot to the front window, pressing her face against glass that was already frosted with ice. The world outside had vanished into a wall of white so complete it swallowed the familiar shapes of trees and rocks, reducing her universe to the small circle of warmth that her cabin represented. Well, she murmured to herself, a habit developed over years of solitary living. This is going to be interesting. The understatement helped calm the flutter of anxiety in her chest. Erwin had survived dozens of blizzards in her 3 years of mountain living, but something about this storm felt different, more personal somehow, as if the winter itself had taken offense at her presence and decided to test the limits of her preparation. She went about her morning routine with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through countless harsh seasons. Coffee brewed on the wood stove while she checked the integrity of her window seals and door latches. The fire that had burned low overnight was fed fresh logs until it crackled with renewed vigor. Her water reserves were inspected, her food stores mentally catalogued, her emergency supplies arranged within easy reach. By mid-morning, the storm had intensified to the point where even thinking about venturing outside would have been suicide. The wind was strong enough to uproot trees, and the snow fell so thick and fast that it accumulated in drifts against her cabin walls with alarming speed. But Erwin felt secure in her small sanctuary. She settled into her reading chair with a cup of tea and a well-worn book of poetry, letting the storm rage while she lost herself in verses about other kinds of weather, gentler seasons, and love that bloomed despite adversity. The scratching began just after noon, so faint at first that she mistook it for branches scraping against the cabin's exterior. But branches moved with the rhythm of the wind, and this sound came in deliberate patterns. 3 short scratches, a pause, then 3 more. Erwin set down her book and listened intently. The scratching came again, definitely at her front door, too purposeful to be accidental and too weak to be threatening. Her heart began to race as she approached the door. In 3 years of mountain living, she had encountered plenty of wildlife. Bears investigating her garbage, deer browsing in her small garden, countless small creatures seeking shelter from storms. But nothing had ever approached during a blizzard this severe. Whatever was outside her door was either desperate or dying, or both. The scratching came a third time, weaker now, and Erwin made her decision. She unlatched the heavy wooden door and pulled it open against the wind's resistance, immediately gasping as cold air slammed into her face like a physical blow. What she saw on her threshold stopped her heart entirely. 3 wolves huddled against her door, their fur so caked with ice and snow that they looked more like sculptures than living creatures. 2 adults, one slightly larger than the other, both clearly exhausted beyond endurance, flanked a pup that couldn't have been more than a few months old. The smallest wolf was barely moving, its small body shaking with cold so severe that even its supernatural healing couldn't compensate. For a moment, Predator and Omega stared at each other across the threshold. Erwin's wolf whimpered deep in her chest, recognizing the authority and strength that radiated from the adult wolves even in their weakened state. Every instinct screamed at her to close the door, to protect herself from creatures whose very nature demanded dominance and submission. But the pup whimpered, a sound so small and lost that it cut through every fear Erwin had ever harbored about wolves and power and her place in the natural order. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, dropping to her knees in the doorway despite the wind and snow. "What happened to you?" The larger wolf, clearly the father, lifted his massive head with tremendous effort. His amber eyes met hers, and she saw intelligence there, along with something that looked remarkably like desperate hope. He glanced at the pup, then back at her, and the message was clear even without words. "Please help us." Erwin looked at the 3 wolves again, calculating the risk against her conscience. They were clearly a family unit, traveling together when they should have sought shelter hours ago. The adults showed signs of severe hypothermia, while the pup was so close to death that she could see its breathing growing shallower with each passing moment. She thought about her grandmother's stories, the old tales about wolves who protected those who showed them kindness. She thought about the unwritten laws of the mountains, where survival often depended on mutual aid between unlikely allies. Most of all, she thought about the pup, whose life was measured now in minutes rather than hours. "Come in," she said, stepping back and opening the door wide. "All of you quickly." The adult wolves exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes. Then, with the careful movements of creatures who understood they were accepting sanctuary from someone they could easily overpower, they helped their pup across the threshold and into the warmth of Erwin's home. The moment she closed the door behind them, the cabin's atmosphere transformed completely. What had been her solitary refuge was now shared space, filled with the presence of 3 creatures whose very existence challenged everything she had learned about safety and solitude. The wolves arranged themselves near her fire with instinctive understanding of heat and hierarchy. The parents flanked their pup protectively while still maintaining respectful distance from Erwin's personal space. They were clearly wild animals, but their behavior suggested intelligence and social awareness that went far beyond mere instinct. "Let me get you something to help with the cold," Erwin said, hurrying to her kitchen area. She prepared warm water in 3 large bowls, adding a touch of honey for energy and warmth. The adult wolves watched her every movement with alert attention, but showed no signs of aggression, only the careful wariness of creatures who understood they were dependent on her goodwill for survival. When she approached with the first bowl, the father wolf's ears flattened slightly in a gesture that seemed more grateful than submissive. He lapped at the warm water carefully, then looked up at her with eyes that held unmistakable intelligence. The mother wolf accepted her bowl with similar grace, but her attention remained primarily focused on the pup, who was still shivering despite the warmth of the fire. When Erwin knelt beside the smallest wolf with the 3rd bowl, she could see how close to hypothermia the little one truly was. "He's so cold," she murmured, gently stroking the pup's ice-matted fur. "His body temperature is dangerously low." The mother wolf made a soft sound that vibrated with distress, nuzzling her pup encouragingly. But the little one could barely lift his head to drink, his small body conserving what little energy remained for basic survival. Erwin made another decision that would have terrified her just hours earlier. She scooped the pup into her arms, wrapping him in one of her softest blankets, before settling back into her reading chair. The adult wolves tensed immediately, their protective instincts flaring at seeing their offspring in human hands. But when the pup's shivering began to subside against Erwin's body heat, they relaxed slightly, understanding that she was helping rather than threatening. "That's better," Erwin whispered to the pup, feeling his tiny heart beating rapidly against her chest. "We'll get you warmed up properly." She spent the next hour providing first aid that was part veterinary care and part motherly instinct. The pup's paws were cleaned of ice and snow, his fur gently dried with soft towels. His small body kept warm against hers, while his parents recovered their own strength by the fire. As the afternoon wore on, the family dynamics became clearer. The father was clearly an alpha, his presence commanding even in exhaustion, while the mother carried herself with the quiet authority of an experienced pack member. But most importantly, both parents seemed to understand that their pup's survival depended entirely on the kindness of the Omega who had opened her door. "You're not local wolves, are you?" Erwin found herself asking, though she didn't expect an answer. "You were traveling when the storm hit, weren't you? Got caught away from your territory." The father wolf's ears perked up at her words, and he tilted his head in what looked remarkably like confirmation. Erwin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Wolves didn't usually travel during winter storms, unless they were fleeing something worse than the weather itself. "What were you running from?" she wondered aloud, but the adult wolves had closed their eyes, finally allowing themselves to rest in the safety of her warm cabin. As evening approached, Erwin prepared a simple meal for herself, while keeping the pup cradled against her chest. The little wolf had improved dramatically once his body temperature stabilized, but he still seemed content to remain in her arms, occasionally opening bright amber eyes to gaze at her with the trusting expression that only very young creatures possessed. "Are you hungry, little one?" she asked softly, noting how he perked up at the sound of her voice. She prepared a small portion of the beef stew she'd made for herself, cooling it to room temperature before offering it to the pup. He ate eagerly, his appetite returning along with his strength, and she felt a maternal satisfaction that surprised her with its intensity. The adult wolves stirred as the scent of food filled the cabin, and Erwin realized she had 3 guests to feed, not just one. "I suppose you're all hungry," she said, returning to her kitchen. "Let me see what I can manage." She prepared portions of her stew for all 3 wolves, along with some dried meat and leftover bread. It was more than she usually ate in 2 days, but watching the family share their first real meal in what was probably days made the sacrifice feel like privilege rather than hardship. As full darkness fell outside, and the storm continued its relentless assault on the mountain, Erwin found herself settled on her small sofa with a wolf pup asleep in her lap, and 2 exhausted adults resting nearby. The scene should have been impossible, an Omega sharing her home with wild wolves, all of them trusting each other despite every instinct that should have kept them apart. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I never expected to have house guests," she told the sleeping pup, gently stroking his now dry fur. "Especially not your kind, but I'm glad you found your way here." The father wolf opened one amber eye and looked at her for a long moment. There was something in that gaze. Gratitude, certainly, but also a deeper recognition that seemed to acknowledge what her kindness had cost and what it had made possible. Outside, the blizzard raged with undiminished fury, trapping them all in a small sanctuary that had become something more than shelter. It had become home to an unlikely family, bound together not by blood or pack law, but by the simple recognition that survival sometimes required trusting strangers, and that warmth, once shared, created bonds that transcended species. As Erwin drifted toward sleep, the pup's small body a comforting weight in her lap, and the sound of the adult wolves' steady breathing, filling her cabin with new rhythms of peace, she couldn't shake the feeling that this storm had brought her exactly what she never knew she needed. Not just guests, but companions. Not just wolves seeking shelter, but a family that had chosen to trust her with their most precious member. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the storm continued and supplies dwindled. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Erwin fell asleep, knowing she wasn't alone, and for the first time in her adult life, she wasn't afraid of what that meant. The wolves had brought more than their need for sanctuary to her door. They had brought the possibility of belonging without surrender, connection without submission, and love that asked for nothing more than the courage to keep the door open when the storm brought unexpected visitors. Erwin woke to the gentle sensation of something warm and furry pressed against her neck. For a moment, suspended between sleep and awareness, she couldn't place the unfamiliar weight or the soft breathing that wasn't her own. Then the wolf pup shifted against her, making a small, contented sound, and the extraordinary events of the previous day crashed back into her consciousness like waves against stone. The storm still raged outside with the same relentless fury that had driven 3 desperate wolves to her door, but the cabin itself had been transformed overnight. Where once silence had been her only companion, now the space hummed with the quiet presence of creatures who had claimed sanctuary in her small world. The adult wolves had repositioned themselves during the night, and Erwin found herself the center of a protective formation that spoke of instincts older than civilization. The father wolf lay stretched along the length of her sofa, his massive form positioned so that he could observe both the door and windows while keeping watch over his sleeping family. The mother wolf had claimed the space beside Erwin's chair, close enough to touch if needed, but maintaining the respectful distance of a guest who understood boundaries. Both adults slept with the light awareness of creatures accustomed to danger, their ears twitching at every shift in the wind's voice. "Good morning," Erwin whispered to the pup, who opened bright amber eyes and regarded her with the absolute trust that only very young creatures could offer. "How are you feeling today, little one?" The wolf pup stretched luxuriously in her lap, his tiny paws extending in a gesture that reminded her powerfully of domestic cats, except these paws would one day carry the strength to run down prey and protect territory. For now, though, he was simply a baby who had found warmth and safety in unlikely arms. At the sound of her voice, both adult wolves lifted their heads in greeting. The father's amber eyes met hers with an intelligence that never failed to surprise her, while the mother's gaze held the particular warmth that Erwin had noticed the evening before, an acceptance that seemed to acknowledge her as part of their family unit, rather than merely their rescuer. "I need to get you all some breakfast," she said softly, beginning the delicate process of extricating herself from her chair without disturbing the pup too dramatically. The little wolf protested the movement with a soft whine, but settled contentedly onto the still warm cushions when his mother approached to nuzzle him reassuringly. The sight of the family's gentle interactions filled Erwin with an emotion she couldn't quite name, something deeper than satisfaction, and warmer than mere happiness. Her morning routine required complete reimagining with 3 additional occupants who had needs she was still learning to anticipate. The wolves watched with alert curiosity as she moved through her small kitchen, their attention focused not on her activities, but on her face, as if they were studying her expressions to understand her moods and intentions. "Let me see what I can manage for breakfast," she told them, opening her pantry to assess supplies that were diminishing faster than she'd initially calculated. The storm showed no signs of abating, and quick mental arithmetic suggested they had perhaps 4 days of adequate nutrition, for all 4 of them before rationing would become necessary. The realization didn't frighten her as much as it probably should have. Instead, she felt a quiet determination to make whatever sacrifices were needed to ensure her guests' survival. These wolves had trusted her with their lives, the lives of their family, and she would not betray that trust regardless of the personal cost. She prepared bowls of warm water mixed with honey and small pieces of the dried meat from her stores, creating a nourishing meal that would help the adults continue their recovery while providing the pup with nutrients appropriate to his age and size. The wolves accepted their breakfast with the same careful gratitude they'd shown the night before, eating slowly and deliberately, as if aware that every morsel represented her generosity. "You don't need to be so careful," Erwin told them gently. "I have enough stored to last us several weeks if we're sensible about portions. Your health is more important than conserving every scrap." The father wolf paused in his eating to look at her directly, and in that gaze she saw a depth of understanding that sent chills down her spine. This was not the simple intelligence of a clever animal. This was awareness that approached human complexity, recognition that acknowledged both her sacrifice and the burden of responsibility that came with accepting it. As the morning progressed, Erwin found herself narrating her activities to her guests, filling the silence that had been her constant companion for 3 years with conversation that felt surprisingly natural, despite its one-sided nature. The wolves listened with obvious attention, their ears perked and heads tilted in ways that suggested they comprehended far more than should have been possible for wild animals. "You know," she said, as she tended the fire, adding logs with careful efficiency to maintain warmth without wasting fuel. "I used to think silence was a luxury. After years of pack meetings where every word had to be measured, where saying the wrong thing could affect your status for months, I thought the absence of conversation was freedom." The mother wolf moved closer as she spoke, settling beside Erwin's chair in a gesture that felt deliberately companionable. Her presence was soothing in ways Erwin hadn't anticipated, Not the overwhelming dominance she'd learned to fear from alpha wolves, but something steadier and more nurturing. "But this is different," Erwin continued, surprised by her own willingness to share memories she'd kept locked away for years. "You listen without judgment, without trying to correct or guide or fix me. You just accept what I choose to share." The pup had awakened from his post-breakfast nap and wobbled over to join the conversation, climbing into Erwin's lap with the confidence of someone who had already claimed that space as rightfully his. She welcomed his weight, finding comfort in the warm pressure of his small body against hers. "I was part of the Silverbrook pack until I turned 21, she found herself saying, the words emerging easier than they had in years of self-imposed isolation. It wasn't a bad pack, really. Alpha Morrison was fair by most standards, and the territory was beautiful. Rolling hills and dense forests, plenty of prey and clean water. She paused, stroking the pup's increasingly fluffy fur as she gathered courage to continue. The adult wolves remained perfectly still, giving her their complete attention in a way that made confession feel safe rather than vulnerable. "But there were expectations," she went on. "Specific roles that Omegas were supposed to fulfill, particular ways we were supposed to contribute to pack stability and hierarchy, caretaking duties, support positions, and most importantly, finding an appropriate mate who could provide protection and produce strong offspring." The father wolf made a soft sound that rumbled with what seemed like disapproval. When Erwin glanced at him, his amber eyes held an expression that appeared to reject the very concept of reducing someone to their breeding potential. "Alpha Morrison chose a mate for me when I turned 20, she continued, encouraged by the wolf's obvious indignation on her behalf. "Beta Marcus Hartwell, a good wolf, really, strong and reliable, and destined for pack leadership. The match made perfect sense from every practical standpoint." The mother wolf moved even closer, her warm bulk pressed against Erwin's legs in a gesture of comfort that seemed to anticipate the pain in what came next. "Except that Marcus saw me as a useful acquisition, rather than a person with individual thoughts and feelings. When I tried to express interest in studying herbal medicine, or learning more about pack history, he would redirect my attention to more appropriate pursuits like den decoration and meal planning. When I questioned some of the pack's policies regarding Omega autonomy, he would explain patiently that such concerns were beyond my understanding." The pup looked up at her with bright, attentive eyes, and Erwin found herself smiling despite the painful memories. The final straw came when I suggested that the pack might benefit from establishing a formal library to preserve our stories and knowledge. Marcus laughed, not cruelly, but with the indulgent amusement you'd show a child playing at adult concerns. He told me that Omegas weren't meant for intellectual pursuits, that my role was to support his ambitions and bear his children, not to waste time on unnecessary complications. The father wolf rose to his feet with fluid grace, moving to position himself directly in front of Erwin's chair. There, he sat and looked at her with an expression so filled with recognition and respect that it took her breath away. The gesture felt like a formal acknowledgement of her worth, not as a potential mate or caregiver or support system, but as an individual deserving of consideration and autonomy. "When I refused to accept the mating arrangement," Erwin continued, her voice growing stronger, "Alpha Morrison made it clear that unmated Omegas past 21 were considered disruptive to pack stability. I could accept Marcus's proposal, find another suitable mate within 6 months, or leave the territory permanently." The mother wolf pressed closer, offering physical comfort as Erwin relived the isolation and rejection that had driven her to this mountain sanctuary. "So I left," she said simply. "I took my inheritance, enough money to buy this cabin and supplies to last several months, and I came here intending to stay just until I figured out where I belonged. That was 3 years ago, and I've been alone ever since." She gestured around the small cabin that had become her entire world. At first, the solitude felt like punishment. I'd wake up expecting to hear pack sounds, conversations and laughter and the constant social noise of living with 40 other people. The silence was so complete it made my ears ring. The pup stretched upward, pressing his small muzzle against her chin in a gesture that felt remarkably like a kiss. The simple affection brought tears to her eyes, but gradually I realized that silence wasn't emptiness, she continued. It was space, room to think my own thoughts, to develop my own interests, to become whoever I wanted to be, without constantly adjusting to others' expectations. She looked around at her guests, taking in the picture they made. two powerful predators and their precious offspring, all of them choosing to listen to her story without trying to fix or change or redirect her. I studied weather patterns and seasonal changes. I learned to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs. I read everything I could find about mountain ecology and wildlife behavior. For the first time in my life, I felt intellectually satisfied, rather than constantly frustrated by limitations others imposed on my curiosity. The adult wolves exchanged a glance that seemed to communicate volumes about their approval of her choices and their understanding of the courage required to build a life from nothing. I thought I'd found the perfect solution, Erwin admitted. Complete independence, no compromises, no need to navigate social hierarchies or romantic expectations. I convinced myself that solitude was superior to any form of pack life. She paused, looking down at the pup who had fallen asleep in her lap, his small body completely relaxed in the security of her arms. But sitting here with you, I'm beginning to realize that maybe what I actually found was the courage to wait for the right kind of family, one that doesn't ask me to diminish myself to fit their needs, but instead makes space for me to be exactly who I am. The word family hung in the air between them like a bridge being built one span at a time. The adult wolves showed no sign of rejecting the designation. Instead, their body language suggested acceptance and even pleasure at being included in such a claim. As the morning turned to afternoon, the wolves began displaying behaviors that spoke of growing comfort with their temporary home. The pup explored the cabin with increasingly confident energy, investigating every corner and crevice while his parents kept watchful but relaxed eyes on his adventures. His curiosity was infectious, and Erwin found herself seeing her familiar space through new eyes as she watched him discover her books, examine her weather instruments, and test the bounce of every piece of furniture. The mother wolf had claimed a permanent spot near the fire where she could observe both her family and Erwin with equal attention. Her presence was steadying in ways that surprised Erwin, not the demanding energy she'd learned to associate with pack wolves, but something calmer and more accepting. When their eyes met, the female wolf's expression held warmth that spoke of genuine affection rather than mere gratitude. Meanwhile, the father wolf had appointed himself guardian of their small domain, moving periodically to check the windows and door while maintaining awareness of every sound from outside the cabin. His vigilance suggested that their flight from whatever danger had driven them into the storm was not merely historical. The threat, whatever it was, remained real and immediate. "You're still worried," Erwin observed as she prepared their midday meal, noting how the large wolf's attention kept drifting to potential entry points. "Whatever you were running from, it's still out there, isn't it?" The father wolf's reaction was immediate and telling. His ears flattened against his head, and a low growl rumbled in his chest, not directed at her, but at the memory of whatever force had compelled them to risk their lives and their pup's safety in deadly weather. "Was it another pack?" she asked gently, setting down his food bowl and settling nearby where she could observe his responses. "Territory disputes? Challenges to your leadership?" The big wolf's hackles rose slightly at her questions, and he glanced toward his mate with an expression that clearly communicated concern and frustration. Whatever they had fled was serious enough to override every protective instinct that should have kept them safely denned during a blizzard. Or was it something else? Erwin pressed, her mind working through possibilities. Something that made staying more dangerous than traveling? The mother wolf lifted her head from her food, amber eyes meeting Erwin's with an expression that seemed to hold both gratitude for her perceptiveness and sorrow at the necessity of their situation. The look confirmed Erwin's growing suspicion that these wolves had been forced from their home by circumstances beyond normal pack conflicts. "Well," she said with quiet determination, "whatever's out there will have to wait until this storm passes. And by then, maybe we can figure out a solution that doesn't involve risking your family's safety." The simple declaration of alliance seemed to have a profound effect on both adult wolves. They exchanged a look that spoke of surprise and something deeper, perhaps the recognition that they had found not just shelter, but genuine partnership in the most unlikely place. As the afternoon progressed, Erwin found herself studying her guests with growing fascination and concern. Their behavior patterns were increasingly difficult to reconcile with her understanding of normal wolf dynamics. The sophistication of their communication, the obvious intelligence behind their decision-making, the careful respect they showed for her space and possessions, all of it suggested creatures whose nature was far more complex than simple wildlife. More troubling was their obvious familiarity with human environments. The pup showed no fear of furniture, household objects, or enclosed spaces, while his parents navigated the small cabin with careful awareness of breakable items and respect for personal belongings. These were wolves who had encountered human civilization before, possibly lived within it. The realization brought new questions that made her increasingly uneasy. If they were familiar with human society, why had they been in wolf form during a deadly blizzard? Why hadn't they sought shelter in a town or settlement rather than risking death in the wilderness? What could have driven them to choose the dangers of the storm over the safety of civilization? "You're not entirely wild, are you?" she asked during a quiet moment, when the pup was napping and the adult wolves were resting by the fire. "You've lived with humans before, haven't you?" The father wolf's ears perked up at her words, and he regarded her with an expression that seemed to weigh how much truth it was safe to reveal. After a long moment, he inclined his head in what could only be interpreted as confirmation. "But something forced you back into wild form," Erwin continued, her detective's instincts engaging despite the impossibility of the conversation. "Something that made human society dangerous for you." The mother wolf whimpered softly, a sound filled with such distress that Erwin immediately abandoned her questioning. Whatever these wolves had experienced, the memory caused genuine pain that she had no right to probe without invitation. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I don't need to understand everything about your situation to help you. You're safe here, regardless of what brought you to my door." The gratitude in their expressions was overwhelming, and Erwin realized she'd crossed some invisible boundary from rescuer to true ally. These wolves were no longer just seeking shelter from the storm. They were beginning to trust her with secrets that could potentially endanger them all. As evening approached and she prepared their shared meal, Erwin found herself moving through routines that were becoming comfortably familiar despite their recent origin. The wolves had established their own patterns within her space: the pup's favorite sleeping spots, the mother's preferred observation post, the father's regular security checks, and somehow, it all fit together like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized was incomplete. "You know," she said as she distributed their food portions, "I spent 3 years convincing myself that this cabin was perfect as it was. Everything in its place. No unexpected disruptions. No need to accommodate anyone else's needs or preferences." The mother wolf looked up from her meal with an expression that seemed to invite further reflection. "But watching you make yourselves at home here, I'm beginning to realize that what I actually had was a house without heart. All the practical necessities for survival, but none of the warmth that turns shelter into sanctuary." She settled into her chair with the pup, who had awakened at the scent of food, and was now regarding her with hopeful eyes. "Would you like to share my dinner, little one?" she asked, offering him small pieces of her own meal. "Your parents are probably tired of doing all the hunting for the family." The pup accepted her offerings with enthusiasm, his tiny tail wagging with pleasure at both the food and the attention. His joy was infectious, and Erwin found herself laughing at his antics, the first genuine laughter she'd experienced in longer than she could remember. The sound seemed to have a magical effect on the adult wolves. Both parents lifted their heads to watch her with expressions that seemed to recognize and appreciate the happiness they were witnessing. The father wolf's tail moved once in what might have been approval, while the mother wolf made a soft sound that vibrated with contentment. As full darkness settled outside and the storm continued its relentless assault on the mountain, Erwin found herself settling into evening routines that had been transformed by the presence of her unlikely family. The pup claimed his regular spot in her lap, while the adult wolves positioned themselves nearby with the easy familiarity of creatures who had found their place in a new social order. But tonight brought something different from the careful distance of the previous evening. The mother wolf, instead of maintaining respectful space, moved to settle at Erwin's feet, resting her head on her boots in a gesture of unmistakable affection. The contact was warm and comforting in ways that surprised Erwin with their intensity. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly, touched by the deliberate intimacy of the gesture. "I know I'm not pack, not really family in any traditional sense." The father wolf's response was even more significant than his mate's. Rising from his position by the fire, he approached Erwin's chair and carefully, deliberately, rested his massive head on the armrest beside her elbow. The gesture placed his powerful jaws within inches of her vulnerable throat, a position that could have been threatening, but instead felt like the ultimate expression of trust and acceptance. "Oh," Erwin whispered, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. "You're saying I am family, aren't you?" The big wolf's amber eyes met hers directly, and in that gaze, she saw confirmation that transcended species and tradition. Family, his expression seemed to say, was not about blood or hierarchy or social structures. It was about choosing to trust, to protect, to care for each other regardless of the storms that might come. The mother wolf stirred at her feet, looking up with eyes that echoed her mate's sentiment. Their message was clear. Erwin had proven herself not through strength or dominance, but through kindness and sacrifice. She had opened her door to strangers in need, shared her resources without counting the cost, and offered comfort without demanding anything in return. In the wolf world, such behavior marked someone as worthy of the deepest loyalty and protection. "Thank you," Erwin said, though the words felt inadequate for the emotional weight of the moment. I never imagined." The pup looked up at her with sleepy contentment, and she realized that this small family had given her something she'd never known she was missing. Not just companionship, but belonging that didn't require her to diminish herself. They saw her exactly as she was, a lone omega with herbs and books and weather instruments, someone who talked to herself and rationed food and found joy in simple routines. And they valued her not despite these characteristics, but because of them. "I love you too," she whispered, the confession emerging easier than she'd expected. "All of you. I don't care if it's impossible or impractical or completely outside normal pack dynamics. You're my family now, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." The declaration seemed to release something in all three wolves. The parents settled more deeply into their positions of closeness, while the pup actually purred, a sound she'd never heard from a wolf before, but which clearly expressed perfect contentment. As the night deepened and the wind outside howled with undiminished fury, Erwin found herself surrounded by a sense of belonging that redefined everything she thought she knew about home and family and love. The storm might rage for days more, and whatever dangers had driven her guests to her door might still be waiting beyond the blizzard's end. But for this moment, in this small sanctuary carved from wilderness and warmed by sacrifice, they were exactly where they belonged. 4 souls who had found in each other the missing pieces that made them whole. The blizzard had brought more than cold and danger to her threshold. It had brought the beginning of a love story that transcended species and tradition, proving that the strongest bonds were not forged by obligation or hierarchy, but by the simple choice to care for each other against whatever storms the world might send. The 3rd day of the blizzard dawned with an eerie quality that made Erwin's skin prickle with unease. The howling wind that had been the storm's constant voice since its arrival had dropped to occasional gusts, but the silence between them felt heavy with anticipation rather than relief. Through her frost-covered windows, she could see that snow continued to fall in thick, steady sheets that added to drifts already higher than her cabin's foundation. But it wasn't the weather that woke her with a start. It was the father wolf's low, urgent growl rumbling through the pre-dawn darkness. Erwin lifted her head from where she'd fallen asleep in her chair, the pup still cradled in her lap, to find the big male standing rigid by the window. His hackles were raised, his ears pinned forward in aggressive alertness, and his entire body radiated tension that spoke of immediate danger rather than general unease. "What is it?" she whispered, careful not to wake the pup, while gently shifting him to a more secure position. The father wolf glanced at her briefly, his amber eyes flashing with warning, before returning his attention to whatever had triggered his alarm. The mother wolf had also awakened and moved to join her mate, both parents now focused on something beyond the cabin walls that Erwin couldn't perceive. Then she heard it. Voices carried on the wind, distant but unmistakably human. Men's voices, speaking in low tones that suggested stealth rather than rescue efforts. The sound sent ice through her veins that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Trackers," she breathed, understanding immediately what had driven the wolves from their previous shelter. The father wolf's confirming growl was barely audible, but the fear in his mate's eyes as she moved protectively closer to their sleeping pup told Erwin everything she needed to know. These were not ordinary wolves fleeing territorial disputes. These were shifters being hunted by humans who knew exactly what they were tracking. Her mind raced through the implications. If hunters had followed their trail through a blizzard that should have erased all scent and sign, they were dealing with professionals equipped with technology that made weather irrelevant. More terrifying still was the realization that anyone willing to pursue shifters through deadly conditions was likely authorized, or at least sanctioned, by authorities who viewed her guests not as people, but as dangerous animals to be eliminated. "How many?" she asked in the barest whisper, though she knew the wolves couldn't answer directly. The father wolf held up one massive paw, extending 4 claws deliberately. 4 men, at least. Enough to surround the cabin and prevent escape even if the storm weren't already making flight impossible. Erwin's practical mind immediately began calculating their options, none of which offered much hope. Her cabin was sturdy, but not fortified against determined intruders. Her emergency supplies included no weapons beyond kitchen knives and a small hatchet meant for splitting kindling. Against 4 armed hunters specifically equipped for tracking shifters, she could offer her guests nothing but moral support and whatever protection her human status might provide. The voices were getting closer now, and through the wind she could make out fragments of conversation that chilled her blood. "Tracks lead directly here. No other shelter for miles. Remember, we need proof of elimination before. Omega might be a hostage situation." The casual discussion of her potential death alongside her guest's certain execution galvanized something fierce and protective in Erwin's chest. These men had come to her sanctuary, tracked suffering creatures through deadly weather, and were now planning violence in the space she'd created for healing and safety. They would not harm her family, not while she drew breath. "Listen to me," she whispered urgently to the wolves, who had arranged themselves in a defensive formation around her chair. "I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" The father wolf looked directly into her eyes, and she saw absolute faith reflected there despite the terror of their situation. His mate moved closer, pressing against Erwin's legs in a gesture that spoke of determination to protect her even at the cost of their own lives. The pup stirred in her lap, sensing the tension around him, and Erwin gently stroked his fur to keep him calm. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, she would not let these hunters harm an innocent child, regardless of species. "When I open the door," she continued in the same urgent whisper, "I need you to stay behind me. Let me do the talking. I'm hoping my human status will give us some protection, at least initially." The knock came before she could say more. Firm, authoritative, the sound of people accustomed to having doors opened without question. "Hello in there," called a voice made artificially jovial by false friendliness. "Forest Service! We're conducting wellness checks due to the severe weather conditions." Erwin almost laughed at the transparent lie. The Forest Service didn't conduct armed tracking operations through blizzards, and real rescue workers would have announced themselves with proper identification and emergency protocols. She rose carefully, settling the pup onto the warm chair cushions where he immediately curled into a ball and pretended to sleep. The adult wolves moved to flank her as she approached the door, their positioning designed to remain out of sight while keeping her within their protection. "Just a moment," she called back, injecting her voice with the breathless relief of an isolated woman grateful for rescue. "Let me get decent." The delay bought her precious seconds to review her strategy. These hunters expected to find either a hostage situation or an abandoned cabin with wolves denning inside. They would not expect a lone Omega who welcomed them as legitimate authorities while cleverly concealing her guest's presence. Her performance would have to be flawless. Erwin opened the door with the wide smile of someone delighted by unexpected company, stepping outside onto the small porch despite the bitter cold. The movement placed her body between the hunters and any view of the cabin's interior, while her obvious humanity would prevent them from immediately resorting to violence. "Thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, wrapping her arms around herself and shivering dramatically. "I was starting to worry about my food supplies if this storm kept up much longer." 4 men stood in her small clearing, all of them equipped with gear that confirmed her worst suspicions. High-tech winter clothing, professional tracking equipment, and weapons designed specifically for large predators. The leader, a tall man with dead eyes, and the kind of military bearing that spoke of government training, stepped forward with a smile that never reached his face. "Ma'am, I'm Agent Collins with the Wildlife Management Division," he said, producing an identification badge that looked convincing enough to fool most civilians. "We've been tracking a pack of dangerous wolves in this area, and we wanted to make sure you were safe." "Wolves?" Erwin infused her voice with appropriate concern, while her mind cataloged every detail of their equipment and positioning. "I haven't seen any wildlife since the storm started. Everything's been hiding from the weather, I suppose." Agent Collins studied her face carefully, looking for signs of deception. "These particular animals are extremely dangerous, ma'am. They've been linked to several attacks in neighboring states, and we have reason to believe they're rabid or otherwise compromised. The lie was delivered with such casual authority that Erwin almost admired the man's skill at deception. These hunters clearly had practice at manipulating civilians into compliance. "Oh my," she said, widening her eyes with manufactured fear. "Should I be worried? My cabin is pretty isolated, if there are dangerous animals around. That's exactly why we need to conduct a thorough search of the area," another hunter interjected, taking a step toward the cabin door. "Standard safety protocol requires us to check all structures for signs of intrusion or den activity." This was the critical moment. If she allowed them inside, her guests would be discovered immediately and killed without ceremony. If she refused, their suspicions would be confirmed, and the result would be the same, except that she would probably die alongside the wolves. "Of course," Erwin said brightly, stepping aside as if to welcome them in. "Though I should warn you, I'm afraid the place is a bit of a mess. I wasn't expecting company, and with the storm keeping me inside for days." She chattered nervously as the hunters approached, playing the role of an isolated woman desperate for human contact. But just as Agent Collins reached for the door handle, she gasped dramatically and pressed her hand to her chest. "Oh, I just remembered. I've been feeling quite unwell the past few days. Fever, chills, terrible cough. I was worried it might be something serious, maybe even contagious. I hope you gentlemen have proper protective gear if you're planning to come inside." The hunters immediately stepped back, their eagerness to enter the cabin replaced by caution at the mention of potential disease. In an era of emerging viruses and biological threats, even hardened professionals took infection risks seriously. "What kind of symptoms exactly?" Agent Collins asked, his voice carrying new wariness. Erwin launched into a detailed description of fictional symptoms that sounded like they could be anything from flu to something far more serious. She coughed realistically, touched her forehead as if checking for fever, and generally presented herself as someone who might be incubating any number of unpleasant conditions. "Maybe we should conduct an external search first," one of the other hunters suggested. "Check the perimeter for tracks or signs of den activity. If the animals are using this area for shelter, there should be evidence outside the building." Agent Collins nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on Erwin with obvious suspicion. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remain outside while we conduct our inspection, for safety reasons." "Outside?" Erwin hugged herself more tightly, her shivering now entirely genuine as the wind cut through her thin clothing. "In this cold, I really don't think I should be exposed to the elements in my condition." "It's standard protocol," Collins insisted, his false friendliness beginning to crack. "We need to ensure the area is secure before allowing civilians to return to potentially compromised structures." The standoff stretched between them like a wire pulled to breaking point. Erwin knew she was running out of time and options. These men were too professional to be deterred much longer by her performance, and staying outside in the cold would eventually expose her to the very real danger of hypothermia. That's when salvation arrived from an unexpected source. The pup's cry echoed from inside the cabin, not the howl of a wolf, but the unmistakable wail of a human child in distress. Every head turned toward the sound, and Erwin saw the hunter's expressions shift from suspicion to confusion. "My baby!" she exclaimed, seizing the opportunity with desperate inspiration. "He's been so sick with this fever. I need to get back to him." She rushed toward the door before anyone could stop her, calling over her shoulder with maternal urgency. "He's only 6 months old. He can't be left alone when he's this ill." The hunters followed her into the cabin, their attention now focused on the supposed child rather than searching for wolves. What they found was a scene that confirmed every detail of Erwin's fabricated story. The pup lay in her reading chair, wrapped in soft blankets with only his dark hair visible above the coverings. His earlier cry had been perfectly timed, and now he maintained the restless sleep of a feverish infant, while Erwin fussed over him with convincing maternal concern. "Poor little man," she murmured, checking his forehead with the back of her hand. "His fever's still so high. I've been giving him fluids and trying to keep him comfortable, but I'm starting to worry about dehydration." The adult wolves had vanished completely, a feat of concealment that would have been impossible if the hunters had been conducting a systematic search. But the presence of a sick infant had shifted the entire dynamic of the encounter, transforming the hunters from predators into uncomfortable intruders in a domestic crisis. "Ma'am," Agent Collins said, his voice carrying new awkwardness. "We still need to complete our inspection. If there are dangerous animals in the area—" "Of course," Erwin agreed readily, never taking her attention from the baby in her arms. "Please, do whatever you need to do. I just hope we can get through this storm soon so I can get him to a doctor." The hunters conducted a perfunctory search of the cabin's main room, but their hearts were clearly no longer in the hunt. The presence of a civilian woman with a sick infant had complicated their mission beyond acceptable parameters, and their body language suggested they were looking for justifiable reasons to abandon the operation, rather than evidence to continue it. "No signs of animal intrusion," one of them reported after checking the windows and examining the floor for tracks. "Building appears secure. No unusual scents or marking," added another, though Erwin noticed he stayed well away from the fireplace area where the wolves' scent would have been strongest. Agent Collins lingered near the door, his instincts clearly telling him that something was wrong with the situation despite the lack of obvious evidence. His eyes swept the cabin one final time, cataloging details that might support his suspicions. "Ma'am," he said finally, "if you see any signs of the animals we're tracking, large wolves, possibly traveling as a family group, you need to contact authorities immediately. Do not attempt to approach or help them. They're extremely dangerous." "Dangerous wolves," Erwin repeated dutifully, rocking the pup gently as he stirred in her arms. "I'll definitely be careful. Thank you so much for checking on us." The hunters filed out of her cabin with obvious relief, their mission technically completed even if unsuccessfully. Through her window, Erwin watched them disappear into the swirling snow, their tracks already being erased by the continuing storm. Only when she was certain they were gone did she allow herself to collapse into her chair, the adrenaline crash leaving her shaking more violently than the cold ever had. "That," she said to the apparently empty cabin, "was entirely too close." The adult wolves materialized from whatever impossible hiding places they'd found, spaces that shouldn't have been large enough to conceal creatures their size. The father wolf approached her chair with obvious concern, pressing his muzzle against her hand in a gesture of both gratitude and reassurance. "Are you all right?" she asked him, then laughed at the absurdity of expecting an answer. "Of course you're all right. You're the ones who managed to become invisible in a one-room cabin." The mother wolf appeared at her other side, her expression conveying the same mixture of relief and lingering anxiety that Erwin felt. The immediate danger had passed, but the fundamental problem remained. Professional hunters knew their approximate location and would return with different strategies once the storm cleared. "We need to talk about what happens next," Erwin said, as the pup stretched and yawned, apparently unconcerned by his recent performance as a human infant. "Those men will be back and they'll come better prepared." The father wolf's ears flattened at her words, acknowledging the truth of her assessment. Whatever respite they'd gained through quick thinking and lucky timing, it was only temporary. "But that's a problem for tomorrow," she continued, gathering the pup into her arms where he immediately curled against her warmth. "Tonight, we're all safe and together. That's what matters most." As evening settled over the mountain and the storm continued its relentless siege, Erwin found herself surrounded by her unlikely family in a cabin that had become far more than shelter. It was a fortress of love built against the cold indifference of a world that saw her guests as monsters rather than people, protection rather than threats. The hunters would return, bringing greater numbers and different strategies. The storm would eventually end, exposing them to dangers that extended far beyond weather. But for this moment, they had sanctuary. And more importantly, they had each other. Looking down at the wolf pup who trusted her completely, flanked by parents who had chosen to see her as family rather than merely a convenient human ally, Erwin realized that everything she'd believed about strength and safety and belonging had been transformed by this extraordinary week. True security didn't come from isolation. It came from finding people worth protecting and being willing to risk everything to keep them safe. Love wasn't a weakness that left you vulnerable. It was the force that made ordinary people capable of extraordinary courage when those they cherished were threatened. The blizzard had brought more than refugees to her door. It had brought the family that would teach her that home wasn't a place you retreated to, but the people you refused to abandon no matter what storms might come, and whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. 1 year later, the autumn air carried the crisp promise of winter, as Erwin stood at the edge of the meadow behind her cabin, watching 3 figures race through the golden grass with unbridled joy. What had once been her solitary sanctuary now echoed with laughter and playful growls. the silence she'd treasured for years replaced by sounds that made her heart sing. "Careful, Aspen," she called to the young boy who was currently winning a spirited game of tag against his parents. "Don't go too far into the trees." The child, no longer the fragile pup she'd cradled through a blizzard, but a sturdy 6-year-old with wild, dark hair and amber eyes that sparkled with mischief, waved acknowledgement before darting behind a boulder with the fluid grace that came naturally to shifter children. His parents followed in hot pursuit, their human forms moving with the same predatory elegance that had first marked them as extraordinary. Erwin smiled as she watched her family play, still marveling at how completely her world had transformed since that storm-torn night when desperate scratching at her door had changed everything. The wolves who had sought shelter in her cabin had indeed been shifters. Refugees from a government program that had been relocating shifter families under the guise of wildlife management. Marcus and Elena Thornwood had been fleeing with their son from hunters who viewed shifters not as people with rights, but as dangerous animals to be controlled or eliminated. The tracking team that had followed them to Erwin's cabin had been part of a larger operation that was eventually exposed and disbanded, but not before dozens of families had been scattered, or worse. "May," Aspen's voice carried across the meadow, using the name he'd called her since learning to speak. "Come play with us." "In a minute, sweetheart," she replied, checking the timer on her phone. The bread should be ready soon. Domestic routines that had once been solitary necessities had become shared pleasures in the year since Marcus and Elena had revealed their true nature and asked her to be part of their family permanently. The cabin had been expanded to accommodate 4 people, with a loft addition that gave Aspen his own space while maintaining the cozy intimacy that made their sanctuary special. The sound of footsteps on the wooden porch announced Marcus's return from his afternoon run through the forest. Even in human form, he moved with the fluid power that had first caught her attention during those terrifying hours when hunters had threatened their safety. His transition from desperate refugee to protective mate had been gradual but inevitable, built on shared danger and growing trust that had blossomed into love deeper than anything Erwin had imagined possible. "The perimeter's clear," he reported, pressing a kiss to her temple as he joined her on the porch. No signs of any unwelcome visitors. The casual security check was part of their daily routine now, a reminder that their peaceful life existed within the context of a world that still held dangers for shifter families. But the constant vigilance felt manageable when shared among people who had chosen to protect each other. "Elena's teaching Aspen to track by scent," Marcus continued, settling onto the wooden bench he'd built beside the door. "He's getting remarkably good at it." Through the meadow, Erwin could see Elena kneeling beside their son, patiently explaining something about reading wind patterns and scent trails. The sight filled her with warmth that had nothing to do with the autumn sunshine. This was education that would keep Aspen safe while honoring his dual nature as both human child and wolf pup. "Have you heard anything more from the relocation committee?" Erwin asked, settling beside Marcus with the easy familiarity that had developed over months of shared domestic life. "Good news, actually," Marcus replied, pulling out his phone to show her the latest message. 3 more families have been successfully relocated to the Montana Sanctuary. The network is growing faster than anyone expected. The Montana Sanctuary was one of several safe havens that had been established for shifter families displaced by the defunct government program. What had started as individual rescues had evolved into a coordinated effort to provide new homes and identities for families who could never safely return to their original territories. Erwin had become an unofficial coordinator for the northern region, her isolated cabin serving as both way station and communication hub for refugees seeking safe passage to permanent settlements. Her experience with Marcus, Elena, and Aspen had taught her skills that proved invaluable in helping traumatized families navigate the complex process of rebuilding their lives. "Mrs. Chen called this morning," she mentioned, referring to the elderly woman who had become their closest neighbor after moving to a cabin 2 miles downhill. "She wanted to know if we'd be able to help with the Nakamura family next week." "The ones with twin toddlers?" Marcus asked, his expression softening with sympathy. "Elena will be thrilled to have little ones to fuss over. She's been missing the baby years since Aspen became such an independent young man." It was true. Elena had retained many of her maternal instincts, even as their son had grown more self-sufficient, and she channeled that nurturing energy into caring for the refugee families who passed through their sanctuary. Her gentle strength had helped dozens of traumatized shifters begin healing from experiences that had shattered their faith in safety and belonging. Speaking of Elena, Erwin said, watching her partner guide Aspen through what appeared to be a lesson in reading territorial markers. She mentioned wanting to talk to you about Aspen's education. The question of whether he should attend regular school or continue with home learning. It was a complex issue that faced all shifter families, how to balance the need for their children to understand human society with the necessity of protecting abilities and knowledge that could make them targets. Aspen was bright, curious, and increasingly aware that his family lived differently from most people, but he was still too young to understand the full implications of his dual nature. I think we should let him choose, Marcus said after a moment's consideration. Start with part-time attendance and see how he handles the social aspects. He needs to understand both worlds if he's going to navigate them successfully. The decision reflected the balanced approach they'd developed to most parenting challenges, respecting Aspen's individual needs while preparing him for a future that would require flexibility and wisdom beyond his years. May, Papa! Aspen's voice carried urgent excitement as he raced toward the cabin with Elena close behind. Mama showed me how to find the rabbit warren. There are babies in there. How wonderful, Erwin said, catching the boy as he launched himself into her arms with typical 6-year-old enthusiasm. Did you remember the rule about wild babies? Look, but don't touch, Aspen recited dutifully. And never disturb the den, because mama rabbits need to feel safe to take care of their families. Exactly right, Elena agreed, arriving slightly out of breath but glowing with pride at her son's quick learning. He has excellent instincts for reading animal behavior. Elena's own transformation over the past year had been remarkable to witness. The terrified mother who had huddled in Erwin's cabin during the blizzard had grown into a confident woman who balanced fierce protectiveness with gentle wisdom. Her relationship with Erwin had evolved from gratitude to genuine partnership. Two women who had found in each other the kind of friendship that transcended conventional categories. Dinner in an hour, Erwin announced, checking her watch and noting that the bread timer would sound soon. Aspen, that gives you time to wash up and help set the table. Can we eat outside again? He asked hopefully. The weather's still nice, and I like watching the stars come out. If you promise to wear your jacket when it gets cold, Elena agreed, ruffling his hair with maternal affection. And no wandering off to investigate interesting sounds in the forest while we're eating. I promise, Aspen said solemnly, though his expression suggested he was already planning ways to explore that wouldn't technically violate the spirit of his agreement. As evening settled over the mountain, the family gathered around the outdoor table Marcus had built on the expanded porch. The meal was simple: fresh bread, soup made from their garden vegetables, and the kind of easy conversation that marked families comfortable in each other's company. Tell the story about the blizzard, Aspen requested as they finished eating, a ritual that had become as established as bedtime itself. Which part would you like to hear? Erwin asked, though she knew the answer. The part where I was so brave that I helped save everyone, he replied, with the confident exaggeration that made the adults exchange amused glances. Well, Elena began with mock seriousness, there was this terrible storm, and a little wolf pup who was very, very cold. As Elena recounted their first meeting with dramatic embellishments that grew more elaborate with each telling, Erwin found herself watching the faces illuminated by their outdoor lanterns. Marcus listened with the indulgent attention of someone who had heard the story hundreds of times, but still found joy in his family's happiness. Elena animated each detail with gestures that made Aspen giggle and gasp in all the right places. And Aspen himself absorbed every word with the satisfaction of a child who knew himself to be the hero of his own origin story. This was what she had never known she was missing during those years of solitary living. Not just companionship, but belonging so complete that she couldn't imagine any other way of being. The wolves who had sought shelter in her cabin had given her far more than their trust. They had given her a new understanding of what family could mean when built on choice rather than obligation, love rather than duty. And then, Elena concluded with flourish, May opened her door and saved us all, and we've been together ever since. The end, Aspen said with satisfaction. That's my favorite story. Mine too, Erwin agreed, reaching out to smooth his hair back from his forehead, though I think the best parts are still being written. As they cleared the dinner dishes and prepared for Aspen's bedtime routine, Erwin reflected on how completely her understanding of home had been transformed. The cabin that had once represented escape from connection had become the heart of a sanctuary that sheltered not just her family, but anyone who needed refuge from a world that could be cruel to those who were different. "May?" Aspen asked as she tucked him into his loft bed. "When I grow up, can I help lost families like you and Mama and Papa do?" "Of course you can, sweetheart," she replied, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "But for now, your job is to grow strong and smart and kind. The helping will come naturally when you're ready." "I'm already kind," he informed her seriously. "Elena says I get it from you." The simple statement filled Erwin with warmth that had nothing to do with the wood stove heating their home. Being seen as a source of goodness by this precious child was an honor she had never expected and would never take for granted. Later, as the adults settled into their evening routine of reading and quiet conversation, Erwin found herself at the window that looked out over the meadow where their story had truly begun. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the thin mountain air, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the howl of wild wolves claiming territory and calling to their families. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked softly, joining her at the window. "About giving up your solitude for all this chaos?" Erwin leaned back against his solid warmth, marveling as she always did at how naturally they fit together, despite the impossibility of their beginning. "Do you know what I regret?" she said, watching the stars wheel overhead in patterns her grandmother had taught her to read. "I regret all those years I spent thinking that being alone was the same thing as being strong." "And now?" Elena asked, settling on her other side with the easy intimacy that had developed among the three adults who shared the responsibility of creating safety for their small family. "Now I know that real strength comes from having people worth protecting," Erwin replied, "and being brave enough to let them protect you in return." Outside their warm sanctuary, winter was coming to the mountains as it always did, bringing cold and snow and challenges that would test their preparation and resilience. But inside, surrounded by the people who had taught her that home was not a place, but a choice, Erwin felt ready for whatever storms might come. The blizzard that had brought 3 desperate wolves to her door had ended more than a year ago, but its gifts continued to multiply with each passing day. Love that began with open doors and shared meals had grown into bonds strong enough to shelter any refugee who found their way through the darkness to the light that burned in their windows. As the 3 adults settled into the comfortable silence of people who had found their place in the world, Erwin offered a quiet prayer of gratitude to whatever forces had sent her family to her door. The lonely Omega, who had once measured strength and independence, had learned that the greatest courage was the willingness to belong completely, to love without reservation and trust without limit. The storms would always return to the mountains, bringing cold and danger, and the chance to prove again that kindness was stronger than fear, that chosen family was more powerful than blood, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply keep your door open for whoever might need sanctuary from the night. In her loft above them, Aspen slept peacefully, dreaming of rabbit warrens and wolf games, and the safety that came from being loved without conditions. His dreams were the future they were all working to create, a world where children could grow up secure in the knowledge that they belonged exactly as they were, protected by adults who had learned that the strongest families were built not on dominance, but on devotion. The blizzard's gifts would last forever, warming them through all the winters yet to come. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.